300 guests watched a woman die standing up. Not the kind of death that leaves a body on the floor, the kind that strips the skin off someone's dignity while an entire church pretends not to notice. Serafina Vale stood at the altar of St. Crispin's in a gown worth more than most families earned in a decade, clutching a bouquet of white roses that had already begun to wilt, and she understood with absolute clarity that the man she was supposed to marry was never going to walk through those doors. What walked through instead changed everything. And by the time you understand exactly how, you'll realize the most dangerous man in this story isn't the one who ran. He's the one who stayed. The first whisper started in the third pew. Margaret Ashford leaned toward her husband with the practiced discretion of a woman who had spent 40 years in London society, perfecting the art of cruelty delivered at a whisper. The words traveled faster than candlelight, spreading from row to row until the entire nave buzzed with the kind of quiet malice that English aristocracy had elevated to a performing art. The Viscount Adrian Blackthorne was not coming. Serafina felt it before she heard it. The shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when 300 people collectively decide someone is finished. She had spent her entire life studying the subtle architecture of social power. Which families held it, which families borrowed it, which families bled for it. And she recognized the exact moment the room turned against her. It settled across her shoulders like a winter fog, cold and indifferent and absolute. Her mother sat frozen in the front pew. Helena Vale, a woman who had wagered everything, her connections, her remaining social currency, the last threads of the Vale family's crumbling respectability, on this single marriage. Her face had gone the color of old parchment, and her gloved hands gripped her hymnal so tightly the leather cover cracked beneath her fingers. Serafina did not look at her. Looking at her mother would mean acknowledging what was happening, and acknowledging what was happening would mean collapsing. And collapsing was something Serafina Vale had decided long ago she would never do in front of people who wanted to watch. So she stood. The minutes crawled past like wounded animals. 5, 10, 15. The vicar cleared his throat 3 times, each iteration more uncomfortable than the last. Children fidgeted. Women exchanged meaningful glances across the aisle. Men checked their pocket watches with the theatrical concern of people who had no actual investment in the outcome, but enjoyed the spectacle enormously. At the 20-minute mark, Serafina's maid of honor, her cousin Eloise, a nervous creature with more loyalty than backbone, touched her elbow and whispered, "Perhaps we should—" "No." The word came out harder than Serafina intended, harder than she knew she was capable of producing. It landed between them like a slap, and Eloise withdrew her hand as though she had touched something burning. Serafina adjusted the bouquet, straightened her spine, fixed her gaze on the stained glass window behind the empty pulpit, where some long-dead saint bled color across the stone floor, and waited. She waited because leaving meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat meant watching her mother's face finally crack. And watching her mother's face crack meant understanding that everything Helena Vale had sacrificed, every humiliation she had swallowed, every creditor she had charmed, every lie she had told about the state of their finances, had been for nothing. So Serafina stood at the altar of a god she did not speak to, and waited for a man who did not deserve the effort. At exactly 31 minutes past the hour, the doors of St. Crispin's opened. The sound was enormous in the held-breath silence of the church. Heavy oak swinging inward on iron hinges that had not been oiled in a century, groaning with the theatrical timing of something designed by fate to announce arrivals of consequence. Every head turned. The man who entered was not Adrian Blackthorne. He was taller, darker, built from different material entirely. Where Adrian moved through the world with the loose-limbed charm of a man who had never suffered a consequence, this man moved with the compressed precision of a weapon that had learned to disguise itself as civilization. Cedric Blackthorne, the Duke of Blackthorne, walked down the center aisle of St. Crispin's Church dressed entirely in black, and the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Not literally, not physically, but every person in that church felt something shift in the base of their spine, the ancient mammalian recognition of a predator entering a confined space. Women pulled their shawls tighter, men straightened involuntarily. Children went quiet without being told. Cedric did not hurry. He did not scan the crowd for familiar faces. He did not acknowledge the collective shock rippling through 3 centuries of accumulated aristocratic composure. He walked with the measured cadence of a man who understood that speed was the province of the desperate, and the Duke of Blackthorn had never been desperate a day in his life. He stopped 6 feet from the altar. His eyes found Seraphina's, and something passed between them that the rest of the church would spend decades trying to name. It was not warmth. It was not sympathy. It was recognition. The cold, surgical identification of one survivor by another. Miss Vale. His voice carried effortlessly, filling the vaulted ceiling without raising above conversational volume. A trick of architecture, or a trick of a man who had spent 33 years learning how to make rooms obey him. Seraphina said nothing. My brother has demonstrated a talent for cowardice that I confess I underestimated. He did not look away from her, did not blink. I'm here to offer you an alternative. The whispers erupted. Margaret Ashford actually gasped. The vicar took a half-step backward, as though proximity to the Duke might be contagious. Seraphina felt the bouquet trembling in her hands and willed it to stop. What kind of alternative? Marriage. The word landed like a mortar shell in the center of 300 aristocratic lives. To you, Seraphina said. Not a question, a confirmation. Because she had already understood from the moment the doors opened and the wrong Blackthorn walked through them exactly what was happening. To me. Why? Kedrick tilted his head by approximately 2 degrees, an almost imperceptible movement that somehow communicated volumes. Because in approximately 90 seconds, every person in this building is going to decide that you are a woman who was publicly discarded. And that decision will follow you for the rest of your life. It will follow your mother. It will follow whatever remains of your family's name. He paused, and the pause was surgical. I am offering you a different outcome. You're offering me yourself. I'm offering you Blackthorn. There was a difference. Seraphina understood it immediately, and the understanding frightened her more than anything Adrian's absence had produced. This man was not proposing romance. He was proposing architecture, a structure of power and protection so absolute that the whispers currently eating her alive would choke on their own insignificance. Helena Vale's voice came from the front pew, thin and urgent. Seraphina, quiet, mother. The command silenced the entire church. Not just Helena, everyone. Because there was something in Seraphina's voice that had not been there 90 seconds ago. Something forged in real time, in the crucible of public humiliation that sounded remarkably like the first notes of authority. She looked at Kedrick Blackthorn. He looked back at her with eyes the color of winter slate, completely unreadable, offering nothing beyond the brutal mathematics of the situation. If I say no, then you walk out of these doors alone, and by Thursday, your family will not receive a single dinner invitation in London. And if I say yes, then you walk out of these doors as the Duchess of Blackthorn, and by Thursday, every family in London will be requesting yours. Seraphina studied him the way a woman studies a cliff edge before deciding whether to jump. She cataloged the details with the desperate precision of someone making the most important decision of her life in less time than it took to order breakfast. The rigid set of his jaw, the faint scar along his left temple that no one in polite society ever mentioned, the absolute stillness of his hands, a man so thoroughly in control of himself that even his body refused to betray uncertainty. Something about that stillness terrified her, and something about it made her feel, for the first time since the church bells started ringing, entirely safe. Yes, the vicar married them in 11 minutes. The ceremony was stripped of every ornamental tradition. No readings, no musical interludes, no tearful exchange of personal vows. Kedrick Blackthorn married Seraphina Vale with the efficiency of a man executing a contract, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke did not kiss her. He extended his arm. She took it. They walked down the aisle together, past 300 faces frozen in varying states of shock, outrage, and reluctant admiration, and the heavy doors of St. Crispin's closed behind them with a sound that felt distinctly like the locking of a vault. The carriage waited outside, black lacquer trimmed in silver, 4 horses the color of smoke. A coachman who did not look at Seraphina, did not acknowledge her existence, simply opened the door with mechanical precision and closed it behind her once she climbed inside. The interior smelled like leather and cedar, and something else, something cold and mineral, like stone walls in deep winter. It smelled like blackthorn. Kedrick settled across from her, and the carriage lurched forward, and England began to slide past the frosted windows in a blur of gray and white. For 12 miles, neither of them spoke. Serafina spent those 12 miles studying the man she had just married with the analytical intensity of someone trying to read a book, written in a language she did not speak. He sat with geometric stillness, one gloved hand resting on his knee, the other against the armrest, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside with the fixed attention of a man who was watching everything and thinking about none of it. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had heard the stories. Kedrick Blackthorne had assumed the dukedom at 21 after his father died. Some said from illness, others said from the accumulated poison of his own cruelty, and had spent the subsequent 12 years transforming the Blackthorne estate into something closer to a sovereign nation than a family property. His tenants were the best fed in northern England. His lands were the most productive. His political influence stretched from Parliament to the Privy Council, and men who had crossed him once rarely survived the experience with enough reputation left to cross anyone again. He was feared because fear was the most efficient currency available to a man who could not afford to be loved. That was the thought that broke the silence. Not because Serafina said it aloud, but because it arrived with such force that it rearranged her understanding of the man sitting across from her. "How long had you planned this?" she asked. Kedrick's gaze shifted from the window to her face. The movement was slow, deliberate, the way a large animal turns its head to acknowledge something that has entered its territory. Define planned. You arrived at St. Crispin's within 30 minutes of your brother's absence, in formal attire, with a carriage waiting. This was not improvisation, Your Grace. A muscle in his jaw tightened. The smallest possible acknowledgement that her observation had landed somewhere important. "I know my brother." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting." The carriage hit a rut in the road and Serafina's shoulder pressed against the window frame. She did not adjust. She held his gaze and let the discomfort register on her face, because she wanted him to understand that she was willing to endure inconvenience if it meant maintaining the position she had staked in this conversation. "I need to know what I've agreed to," she said. "You've agreed to be the Duchess of Blackthorne." "I know the title. I'm asking about the terms." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not warmth, not amusement, something closer to the first tremor of a recognition he had not expected to feel so soon. "You'll have your own quarters, your own staff, your own accounts. You will want for nothing material, and you will be denied nothing reasonable." He listed these provisions with the clipped authority of a man dictating military logistics. "In return, you will conduct yourself as the Duchess in all public settings. You will not embarrass the Blackthorne name. You will not communicate with Adrian under any circumstances, and you will not mistake this arrangement for something it is not." And what is it not? Sentimental. The word fell between them like a blade. Serafina absorbed it without flinching. She tucked it into the growing archive of information she was building about this man. His precise language, his controlled physicality, his absolute refusal to offer anything that could be interpreted as emotional currency. A man who rules this way, she thought, is either protecting something he cannot afford to lose or hiding something he is terrified to name. "Understood," she said. Kedrick held her gaze for 3 additional seconds. She counted, then returned his attention to the window. Neither of them spoke for the remaining 40 miles. Blackthorne Keep announced itself long before it came into view. The landscape changed first. The gentle farmland of the English Midlands gave way to something harder. Ancient forests of oak and ash crowding against the road, their bare branches lacing together overhead like the interlocked fingers of something enormous and patient. The sky lowered. The air thickened. Even the quality of light shifted, turning from winter gray to something deeper, something that suggested the sun had negotiated a truce with this particular stretch of England and agreed to keep its distance. Then the walls appeared. They rose from the ridge like geological formations, not built so much as extracted from the earth itself. Massive stone fortifications stained dark with centuries of rain and smoke, punctuated by towers that had watched every invasion, rebellion, and dynastic collapse in English history with equal indifference. The gatehouse alone was larger than most country estates. Its iron portcullis raised but clearly functional, clearly maintained, clearly capable of slamming shut at a moment's notice. The carriage passed through the outer walls and entered the estate grounds, and Serafina's first impression was not grandeur. It was discipline. Every hedge was geometrically precise. Every stone path was swept clean. Every servant visible in the grounds moved with purposeful efficiency, their postures straight, their movements economical, their gazes directed forward. There was no idle conversation, no wasted motion, no evidence that anyone within these walls did anything that had not been specifically authorized by the man sitting across from her. Blackthorn Keep was not a home. It was a system. A machine of stone and human labor designed to execute the will of one man with flawless precision. And she was now inside it. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, and a man appeared at the door with the instantaneous reliability of a mechanism triggered by proximity. Tall, thin, somewhere between 50 and eternity, dressed in black that made Caedric's funeral attire look festive by comparison. "Your Grace." The man opened the carriage door and stepped back. His eyes passed over Serafina with the professional neutrality of someone appraising new furniture. "The East Chambers have been prepared." "Thank you, Hargraves." Caedric stepped down first. He did not offer his hand to Serafina. He simply waited while she descended on her own, and when her feet touched the gravel, he turned and walked toward the entrance without looking back. She followed. The interior of Blackthorn Keep was everything the exterior promised, and nothing Serafina expected. Enormous hallways lined with portraits of Blackthorn ancestors whose painted eyes tracked visitors with genetic disapproval. Ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. Fireplaces large enough to roast livestock, burning with flames that seemed personally offended by the concept of warmth. They produced light and heat as obligations, not gifts. Hargraves materialized beside her as Caedric disappeared down a corridor without explanation or farewell. "This way, Your Grace." The title sounded strange, wrong, like wearing someone else's coat and finding it both too large and too heavy. "My name is Serafina." Hargraves continued walking without acknowledgement. "This way, Your Grace." He led her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the faintly metallic scent of a building that had been cold for so many centuries it had forgotten how to be otherwise. They climbed a staircase wide enough for 6 people to walk abreast, passed through a gallery of medieval weaponry displayed with museum precision, and finally stopped before a set of double doors in the east wing. Hargraves opened them without ceremony. The room beyond was magnificent and impersonal, a 4-poster bed draped in deep blue damask, a writing desk positioned before tall windows overlooking the frozen gardens, a fireplace already burning, a dressing room visible through an adjoining door where she could see gowns, new gowns, expensive gowns, gowns that had not been ordered by her, already hanging in neat rows. "Dinner is served at 8, Hargraves said. "The Duke dines in the West Gallery. Tardiness is not accommodated." He withdrew and closed the doors, and Serafina stood alone in the center of the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. She did not cry. She wanted to make that perfectly clear to herself, in the silence of her own mind as a matter of record. She did not cry because crying was a luxury afforded to women who had other options, and Serafina Blackthorn, had burned every other option to the ground approximately 4 hours ago when she said yes to a man who had explicitly told her not to expect sentiment. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out over the frozen gardens of Blackthorn Keep. Snow covered everything. The hedgerows, the fountains, the skeletal remains of rose gardens that she somehow knew, without evidence, without reason, had once been beautiful. The landscape was preserved in suspended animation, waiting for something to change, enduring the cold with the particular patience of living things that understand winter is not permanent, but refuse to promise when it will end. She pressed her palm against the glass. It was so cold it burned. This is what survival looks like, she thought. You stand at a window in a stranger's castle wearing a dead woman's title, and you do not cry. You do not collapse. You do not allow yourself the indulgence of asking what might have been, because what might have been was never real. The only thing that was ever real was what you could endure. Dinner arrived at 8. The West Gallery was a long, vaulted room lit by candelabras spaced with mathematical precision along a table that could seat 30 but was set for two. Kadric sat at the far end, already eating, his attention fixed on a leather-bound folio spread open beside his plate. Serafina entered at exactly 8 o'clock. Not early, not late. She had counted the chimes of the hallway clock and timed her arrival to the second, because she understood instinctively that a man who ran his household like a military operation would notice punctuality the way other men noticed beauty. He looked up when she appeared. Something crossed his face, fast, controlled, immediately suppressed, that Serafina filed away for future analysis. Sit. She sat. A servant materialized with a plate. Roasted pheasant, root vegetables, bread that smelled like it had been baked within the hour. Another servant filled her glass with wine so dark it looked like liquid night. Kadric returned his attention to the folio. Serafina ate 3 bites in silence before speaking. Do you always read during meals? Do you always talk during them? When the alternative is silence with a stranger, yes. He looked up again. The candlelight caught the scar along his temple and turned it silver. We're married. Strangers seems inaccurate. Married and acquainted are different things. Most marriages in this country are proof of exactly that. She took a sip of wine. It was extraordinary, deep and complex, and probably worth more per bottle than her mother's monthly household budget. You said this arrangement isn't sentimental. I accepted that, but I won't accept invisible. Something shifted in his posture. Minute, almost subliminal. The way a structure adjusts when unexpected weight is placed on a load-bearing wall. What would visibility look like to you? Conversation at meals? Information about the household I'm apparently now responsible for? An explanation of what's expected of me beyond punctuality and good behavior? Those are reasonable requests. They're not requests. They're conditions. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The memory of one. The ghost of an expression that might once have been human before years of discipline ground it into something unrecognizable. You're not what I expected, he said. You're exactly what I expected. And what was that? A man who confuses control with safety. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Blackthorn Keep had heard in years. Kadric closed the folio slowly, set down his fork, gave Serafina his full attention for the first time since the carriage, and the weight of that attention was like standing in the path of something massive and slow-moving and absolutely certain of its direction. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said quietly. Then teach me. He stared at her across 30 feet of candlelit table, across the wreckage of a wedding that should have been his brother's, across the invisible architecture of a marriage built on transaction and desperation, and he said nothing. But he did not look away. And in a household where the Duke's attention was the most valuable and dangerous currency in existence, that refusal to look away was worth more than any words he could have offered. The following weeks inside Blackthorn Keep taught Serafina 2 things simultaneously. The first was that Kadric Blackthorn was the most disciplined human being she had ever encountered. He rose at 5 every morning, regardless of season or weather. He rode the estate perimeter before breakfast. He reviewed accounts, corresponded with solicitors, met with tenants, and managed political relationships with the relentless efficiency of a man who believed that rest was simply the interval between productive hours. His day was a sequence of controlled outputs, each calibrated to maintain the vast machinery of the Blackthorn Empire, and any deviation from the sequence was treated not as inconvenience but as threat. The second thing Serafina learned was that the Duke was watching her, not overtly, not with the crude surveillance of a jealous husband, but with the systematic attention of a man who cataloged details the way other men collected debts, quietly, thoroughly, and with the clear intention of eventual use. She noticed it first with the books. 3 days after her arrival, she mentioned during their now nightly dinners that she had once loved the essays of Mary Wollstonecraft. She said it offhandedly, as part of a larger conversation about education that Kadric had navigated with surprising intellectual engagement. The next morning, a complete leather-bound collection appeared on her writing desk. No note, no explanation, simply present, as though the books had materialized from the stone walls of the keep itself. A week later, she told Hargraves, not Kadric, that the cold in the east wing made sleeping difficult. By that evening, 2 additional fireplaces in her chambers had been lit, and a new set of fur-lined blankets had appeared on her bed. When she mentioned it at dinner, Cedric responded without looking up from his correspondence. The East Wing drafts are a structural issue. They've been addressed. With fur blankets. With adequate insulation. He never acknowledged the gesture, never accepted credit, never allowed the transaction to become personal. He simply identified a need, eliminated it, and returned to his routine as though the entire exchange had been an administrative correction rather than an act of, what, care? Possession? The distinction between the two, Serafina was beginning to understand, was the central question of her marriage. The roses answered it. She found them on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into her residency, while exploring the East Garden in a borrowed coat and boots that were slightly too large. A greenhouse wing, enormous and obviously disused for years, had been reopened. Inside, in carefully maintained rows, roses bloomed in defiance of the winter pressing against the glass walls. Red roses. Hundreds of them. The air inside was warm and humid and impossibly alive, a controlled rebellion against everything the frozen landscape represented. Serafina stood among them for 20 minutes, breathing in the scent of summer in the middle of January, before she noticed the gardener watching her from the far end of the greenhouse. An old man with soil-stained hands and the careful expression of someone who had been given specific instructions. "How long have these been growing?" she asked. "His Grace ordered the wing reopened 10 days ago, Your Grace." "Why?" The gardener looked at her with something approaching pity. "You admired the rose gardens from your window, Your Grace." His Grace noticed. Serafina walked back to the keep through the falling snow, with the scent of roses still clinging to her coat and a new understanding settling into her chest like something heavy and warm and not entirely welcome. Cedric Blackthorne did not express affection. He engineered environments. He identified what someone needed or wanted, and he constructed systems to deliver it with maximum efficiency and minimum emotional exposure. It was generosity stripped of vulnerability, the architectural equivalent of love, built to withstand any siege. And it was, Serafina realized with a clarity that frightened her, the most honest form of devotion she had ever encountered. That night at dinner, she sat closer to his end of the table. Not dramatically, she simply chose a seat 12 places nearer than protocol demanded and watched his reaction. He glanced at the gap she had closed, then at her, then back at his plate. "The pheasant is better when it's warm," she said. "The pheasant is the same temperature regardless of where you sit. But the company improves." He did not respond, but he did not object. And when Hargraves moved to reset the table to its proper configuration, Cedric stopped him with a single raised finger. "Leave it." 2 words. Barely audible. But inside the rigid architecture of Blackthorne Keep, they registered like cannon fire. The invitation to the Ashbourne Winter Ball arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by a courier whose horse was lathered with the urgency of someone delivering explosives disguised as social correspondence. Cedric read it at breakfast with the expression of a man examining a battlefield map, then set it aside without comment. Serafina picked it up. "We're expected at Ashbourne Palace. The Countess of Ashbourne requests the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne. We're expected everywhere. That doesn't mean we attend. Your brother will be there." The stillness that followed was different from his usual control. This was the stillness of a man whose interior landscape had just shifted violently beneath a perfectly maintained exterior. "How do you know that?" "Because Eloise wrote to me. Adrian has been telling London society that you coerced me into marriage, that the entire ceremony was orchestrated, that I'm essentially a prisoner in your estate." She paused. "Is any of that true?" Cedric looked at her across the table with eyes that contained entire weather systems, storms and frost, and the distant suggestion of something that might once have been sunlight before it learned better. "You tell me," he said. "Are you a prisoner?" "I'm asking because I need to hear you say no." "And if I can't?" The question hung between them like smoke from a fire neither of them had started, but both of them were feeding. Serafina felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not anger, but the grinding tectonic movement of a woman recalculating the fundamental assumptions of her situation. Before she could respond, Hargraves appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, a visitor has arrived." Kadrick's jaw tightened. I'm not expecting anyone. No, Your Grace. Hargraves paused, and in that pause, Seraphina heard something she had never heard in the butler's voice before. Uncertainty. It is Lord Adrian Blackthorne. He is requesting an audience with the Duchess. The temperature in the room collapsed. Kadrick rose from his chair with a speed that contradicted every controlled movement Seraphina she had observed in 3 weeks of marriage. His napkin hit the table like a gauntlet. He is not stepping foot inside this house. He is already inside, Your Grace. He entered through the south corridor. The staff were unable to— Unable? The single word carried enough voltage to light every candle in the keep simultaneously. Hargraves, a man who had served Blackthorne Dukes for 30 years without visible emotion, took an involuntary step backward. Seraphina stood. Both men looked at her. I'll see him, she said. Kadrick turned on her with an expression she had never seen before. Something raw and uncontrolled breaking through the surface of his discipline like bone through skin. You will not. He came to see me. If we refuse, he takes that refusal back to London and it becomes proof of everything he's been saying. I don't care what he says to London. You should, because London is already listening. The silence between them crackled with a new kind of electricity, not the careful negotiation of strangers learning each other's boundaries, but the first real collision of two people who had both decided they were willing to fight. Kadrick stared at her. She stared back. And somewhere in the south corridor of Blackthorne Keep, the man who had abandoned her at the altar was walking through her husband's house as though he still owned it. Adrian Blackthorne stood in the south drawing room with the easy posture of a man who believed architecture owed him something. He had not removed his riding coat, had not surrendered his gloves to the staff. He stood beside the fireplace with one elbow resting on the mantelpiece, as though he had never left, as though this house and everything inside it still answered to the charm he had spent 28 years weaponizing. Seraphina entered first. She felt Kadrick behind her, not touching, not guiding, but present in the way a loaded weapon is present when placed on a table. The air between her shoulder blades hummed with the specific frequency of a man restraining something enormous. Adrian turned. His face performed the complicated choreography of surprise, relief, and wounded sincerity that Seraphina had once found irresistible and now recognized as fluency in a language she no longer spoke. Seraphina. He stepped forward. Thank God. I was afraid they wouldn't let me. They didn't let you. Kadrick's voice came from the doorway like a blade drawn from a sheath. You forced your way past my staff, in my house. Let's begin with that clarity. Adrian's gaze shifted to his brother with the practiced nonchalance of a man who had spent his entire life standing in larger shadows and learning to pretend the shade was comfortable. Hello, brother. Still decorating everything with threats, I see. Still entering rooms you haven't been invited into. I came to see my— Adrian caught himself. The correction arrived too late to be graceful. I came to see Seraphina. Your what? Kadrick stepped into the room, and the dimensions of the space seemed to contract around him. Finish the sentence, Adrian. I'm curious which word you were about to use for a woman you abandoned at an altar in front of 300 people. That's exactly what I came to explain. Explain. Kadrick tasted the word like something rotten. You've had 5 weeks. You could have written. You could have sent a solicitor. Instead, you ride unannounced into my estate, force past my household, and now you want to explain. Seraphina watched the exchange with the focused attention of a woman learning the grammar of a conflict that predated her involvement by decades. The brothers occupied opposite ends of a spectrum she was only beginning to understand. Adrian all surface and motion, Kadrick all depth and compression. Two versions of the same bloodline that had diverged so completely they now operated as different species. I panicked, Adrian said. He directed the admission at Seraphina, deliberately excluding Kadrick from the circuit of his contrition. The morning of the wedding, I realized I wasn't ready. I wasn't worthy of what you deserved, and rather than stand before you and lie, you chose to not stand before her at all. Kadrick moved to the window. His reflection appeared in the glass, a dark silhouette against the snow-covered grounds. Cowardice dressed as consideration, your specialty. I'm not talking to you. You're talking in my house. That means you're talking to me. Seraphina's voice cut between them with the precision she had been developing over 5 weeks of navigating Blackthorn Keep's emotional minefield. Both of you, stop! The room obeyed. She looked at Adrian, really looked at him for the first time since the church. He was handsome the way expensive things are handsome. Polished, well-proportioned, designed to be admired from a comfortable distance. His eyes were the same color as Cadrick's, that blackthorn slate, but where Cadrick's contained weather systems and geological pressure, Adrian's contained reflections. Surfaces, the shimmering promise of depth that dissolved on contact. You left me standing at the altar, Seraphina said. You did not write. You did not send word. You let me stand there for 31 minutes while 300 people decided I was worthless. Do you understand what those 31 minutes cost? That's why I'm here, to make it right. How exactly do you make that right, Adrian? I'm married to your brother in the house you grew up in, wearing gowns that were purchased with Blackthorn money, sleeping in chambers that overlook gardens your mother planted. She paused, and the pause was loaded with 5 weeks of accumulated understanding. What exactly did you come here to fix? Adrian glanced at Cadrick's reflection in the window. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, Seraphina decided, but the irritation of a man whose narrative was being disrupted by inconvenient facts. I came to make sure you're here by choice. The sentence detonated with surgical precision. Cadrick turned from the window. The movement was slow, controlled, but Seraphina had spent enough time studying the mechanical architecture of his restraint to recognize the fault lines forming beneath it. His hands, those impossibly disciplined instruments, had curled into fists at his sides. Get out! I'm asking her, not you. Get out of my house. Why? Adrian stepped closer to Seraphina, and the air between the brothers compressed to a point where the physics of the room seemed to strain. If she's here freely, why can't she say so? If this marriage is legitimate, why does the question make you reach for your fists? The silence that followed was a living thing. It breathed. It pressed against the walls. It settled over the three of them like a weather event that would require cleanup. Seraphina felt both men waiting for her, one needing her answer as vindication, the other needing it as ammunition, and understood with the cold clarity of someone standing at a crossroads in a snowstorm that whatever she said next would permanently alter the architecture of her marriage. She chose her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. I am here by choice. She looked at Adrian. Not because your brother rescued me, not because I had no other option, but because when you left me standing in that church, the only person who walked through those doors and treated me like someone worth choosing was the man you spent your entire life resenting. Adrian flinched. It was small, a contraction around the eyes, a tightening of the mouth, but it was real, and Seraphina cataloged it with the same analytical precision Cadrick applied to estate accounts. He didn't choose you, Seraphina. He acquired you. There's a difference, and if you can't see it, don't tell me what I can't see. Her voice dropped to a register she hadn't known she possessed. Something forged in the frozen corridors of Blackthorn Keep, tempered by 5 weeks of learning to occupy space in a house built for one man's exclusive dominion. I spent 31 minutes learning what it looks like when someone decides you're not worth showing up for. I will not spend another second listening to that same person lecture me about the quality of someone else's intentions. Adrian stared at her. For the first time since his arrival, the choreography of his expressions failed, and what appeared beneath the performance was something uncomfortably honest. The face of a man realizing he had returned to claim something that no longer existed. Cadrick. Seraphina did not look at her husband. She kept her gaze fixed on Adrian. Please have Hargraves escort your brother to the south gate. A beat. Then 2. Hargraves. The butler appeared with the supernatural inevitability of a man who had been listening from the adjacent corridor. Your Grace. Lord Adrian is leaving. Adrian looked between them. The brother who had never loved him, the woman he had thrown away, the butler who had once served him breakfast every morning. And something collapsed behind his eyes. Not defeat. Recalibration. The fast predatory adjustment of a man who had lost this particular battle and was already planning the next campaign. You'll regret this, he said to Seraphina. Not today, not next week. But eventually you'll understand what he actually is, and when that happens, remember I tried to warn you." He left the way he entered, without permission, without grace, and without any evidence that the encounter had cost him anything except time. But Serafina had watched him closely enough to know better. She had seen his hands shake when she chose Cadric, and she had seen Cadric's hands unclench when she did. The aftermath of Adrian's visit restructured the interior dynamics of Blackthorn Keep with the subtlety of a controlled demolition. Cadric did not mention the encounter. Not at dinner. Not during the morning ride Serafina had begun joining, sitting astride a dappled mare that moved through the frozen countryside with the steady patience of an animal accustomed to bad weather. Not during the evening hours in the library, where they had developed an unspoken ritual of reading in proximity. Not together precisely, but in the same room, breathing the same air, allowing silence to do the work that conversation had not yet earned the right to attempt. He did not mention it, but he changed. The changes were structural, not emotional. His household instructions shifted to include Serafina's preferences as operational parameters. The kitchen began preparing meals she favored without her requesting them. A second writing desk appeared in the library, positioned near the fire, angled to receive afternoon light. Her correspondence, previously delivered through Hargraves, began arriving on a silver tray beside her breakfast plate. The same tray, Serafina noticed, that held the Duke's morning dispatches. She was being integrated into his system, not as an addition, as a component, something load-bearing. The realization arrived during a Tuesday morning ride along the estate's northern boundary, where the Blackthorn lands met a ridge of ancient oaks that marked the edge of his territorial authority. Cadric rode ahead, his posture communicating the particular alertness of a man surveying borders, checking for weakness, maintaining the perimeter of a kingdom he had never asked to inherit, but would die before surrendering. Serafina pulled her horse alongside his. "You haven't asked me about Adrian's visit." "There's nothing to ask." "You were furious." "I was concerned about security protocols." She almost laughed. Almost. The impulse rose and was suppressed in the same instant, because laughing at Cadric Blackthorn's deflections felt dangerously close to intimacy, and intimacy was a territory neither of them had agreed to enter. "You were furious because he touched something you consider yours." Cadric's horse shifted beneath him, responding to some invisible tension transmitted through the reins. "I was furious because a man who abandoned his responsibilities walked into my home and attempted to destabilize a situation I had spent 5 weeks stabilizing." "A situation? Is that what I am?" He looked at her. The winter light caught his face at an angle that stripped away the usual shadows and revealed something underneath the granite. Exhaustion. Not physical. The deeper kind. The exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing defenses and was discovering, with something close to horror, that the most persistent threat was coming from inside the walls. "You are not a situation," he said quietly, "and I am trying very hard not to make you one." The admission cost him something visible. She watched it happen. A fractional softening around his eyes, a momentary loosening of the jaw, before the architecture of his control reassembled itself with mechanical precision. They rode back in silence, but the distance between their horses had narrowed by half, and neither of them corrected it. The invitation to Ashbourne Palace sat on Cadric's desk for 9 days before Serafina addressed it directly. She chose her moment with the strategic patience she had been learning from the man himself, waiting until they were alone in the library on a Thursday evening, the fire burning low, the house quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the corridor. "We need to attend the Ashbourne ball." Cadric did not look up from his correspondence. "No?" "Adrian has spent 5 weeks telling London you coerced me into marriage. He spent the last 9 days telling them I'm a prisoner who won't be permitted to attend social functions. Every day we stay here, his version becomes the accepted truth. His version is irrelevant. His version is becoming policy. I received a letter from Eloise yesterday. 2 families have already withdrawn dinner invitations citing concerns about the legitimacy of our marriage. A member of Parliament, your political ally, not Adrian's, has privately suggested an inquiry." Cadric set down his pen. The gesture was small, precise, and devastating, the equivalent of another man slamming his fist through a table. "Who?" "Lord Pemberton." Something cold moved through Kaedric's expression. Not anger, strategy, the rapid, ruthless recalculation of a man whose chessboard had just been altered by an opponent he had underestimated. Pemberton owes me his seat. And apparently he owes Adrian his loyalty, which should tell you everything about how dangerous your brother has become while you've been hiding behind these walls. I don't hide. Then prove it. Attend the ball. Walk into Ashbourne Palace with your wife on your arm and let London see what it's looking at. Because right now they're looking at absence, and absence tells whatever story the loudest voice in the room decides to tell. He stared at her across the library with an expression she had never seen before. Something between admiration and alarm, as though he had brought a decorative blade into his home and discovered it was sharp enough to cut him. You understand, he said slowly, that attending means confrontation. Adrian will be there. His allies will be there. Every person in that room will be watching us for fractures. Then we don't fracture. You say that as though it's simple. I say it as a woman who stood at an altar for 31 minutes without breaking. I know exactly how much pressure I can take, Your Grace. The question is whether you trust me enough to find out. The clock in the corridor struck 10. The fire shifted and settled. Somewhere in the frozen gardens below, wind moved through the bare branches of his mother's rose bushes with a sound like whispered instruction. Kaedric picked up his pen. Tell Hargraves to prepare the London wardrobe. Serafina left the library without another word, but she paused in the corridor long enough to press her palm against the stone wall and feel the cold radiate through her skin. Her heart was hammering, not from fear, from the electric recognition of a threshold being crossed, the specific, irreversible sensation of two people who had been circling each other for weeks, finally agreeing to face the same direction. They had been opponents. Now they were becoming allies. And Serafina understood, with a wisdom that 5 weeks in Blackthorn Keep had beaten into her bones, that alliances forged in cold stone lasted longer than any marriage built on warmth. The preparations for Ashbourne consumed 7 days. Kaedric approached the ball the way he approached territorial disputes, with intelligence gathering, strategic positioning, and the kind of detailed operational planning that would have impressed a military commander. He spent 3 days corresponding with allies in London, quietly rebuilding the network Adrian had been eroding with charm and insinuation. He reviewed every guest list, identified every potential adversary, mapped every political alignment in the room with the forensic precision of a man who understood that social warfare was simply warfare conducted with better clothing. Serafina prepared differently. She spent her evenings in the library reading everything she could find about the Blackthorn family's political history. The alliances, the rivalries, the debts, both financial and personal, that Kaedric had accumulated over 12 years of ruthless estate management. She studied the guest list as though it were a battlefield map, memorizing names, titles, relationships, and vulnerabilities with the methodical intensity of a woman who had discovered that knowledge was the only currency accepted in every market. On the morning of their departure, she descended the main staircase wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that Kaedric had ordered from London 3 weeks earlier. The color matched the Blackthorn family crest. The cut was deliberately severe, high collar, structured bodice, sleeves that terminated at the wrist with military precision. It was not a gown designed to seduce. It was a gown designed to announce. Kaedric waited at the base of the stairs. He looked at her, and something happened to his face that Serafina would remember for the rest of her life. Not softening, not warmth, but a visible recalibration. The moment a man who had spent decades categorizing the world into threats and assets realized he was looking at something that refused to fit either category. "The color suits you," he said. "The color was your choice. Most of my choices have been strategic. And this one?" He offered his arm. She took it, and the warmth that transferred through 2 layers of fabric and the leather of his glove was enough to make them both pretend they hadn't noticed. The carriage departed Blackthorn Keep at noon, heading south toward London, and a confrontation that would determine whether their marriage survived as political architecture or became something neither of them had the vocabulary to name. They traveled in near silence, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers occupying shared space. It was the silence of 2 people conserving energy before a fight, each aware that the other was running the same calculations, mapping the same threats, preparing for the same collision. 40 miles south of the keep, Serafina spoke without looking away from the window. When we arrive at Ashbourne, Adrian will try to separate us. He'll approach me privately, or he'll engineer a conversation that excludes you. He needs to demonstrate that I'm accessible without your presence. Cadrick's gaze sharpened. You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 7 days. And your recommendation? She turned from the window. Let him. The suggestion landed in the carriage like a lit match in dry timber. Absolutely not. If you guard me like a possession, you confirm every accusation he's made. But if I stand in front of Adrian Blackthorne at the most important social event of the season and choose you in public, visibly, undeniably, that's not protection. That's proof. Kedrick studied her with the intensity of a man watching someone dismantle a bomb with steady hands. She could see the war behind his eyes, the possessive machinery of his nature grinding against the strategic logic of her argument. Two fundamental drives fighting for control of a man who had built his entire identity on never losing control at all. You're asking me to do the one thing I am not built to do. What's that? Stand in a room and watch someone approach you without intervening. I'm asking you to trust me. Trust. He said the word like it was a foreign language, something he had studied academically but never practiced conversationally. You're asking the wrong man for that. I'm asking the only man who matters. The carriage wheels ground against the road. The English countryside slid past in shades of gray and reluctant green, winter loosening its grip one field at a time. Cadrick looked at her for a long time. Long enough for the silence to develop weight and texture and a temperature of its own. Long enough for Serafina to understand that what she was witnessing was not hesitation, but the geological process of a man reshaping his own interior landscape, moving mountains he had spent decades constructing because someone he was beginning to need had asked him to. If he touches you, Cadrick said finally, the arrangement changes. He won't touch me. If he does, then I'll handle it. That's not what I said. She held his gaze. I know exactly what you said. Ashbourne Palace materialized through the evening fog like a threat disguised as civilization. Columns of white marble, windows blazing with candlelight, carriages lining the circular drive like a military staging ground for the socially ambitious. The sound of music and voices reached them before the carriage stopped, a wall of cultivated noise that promised elegance and delivered judgment. Kedrick stepped out first. He turned and offered Serafina his hand. She took it. And as they walked together toward the blazing entrance of Ashbourne Palace, past the lined carriages and the liveried footmen and the muffled roar of 300 aristocrats gathered to witness whatever spectacle the evening would produce, Serafina felt Cadrick's fingers tighten around hers. Not possessively, not protectively. With the desperate, controlled pressure of a man holding on to the only thing that had ever made him consider the possibility that strength might not require solitude. The doors opened. The light swallowed them. And across the ballroom, leaning against a marble column with a champagne glass in his hand and destruction in his smile, Adrian Blackthorne watched his brother's wife enter the room and began to move. The ballroom at Ashbourne Palace operated on the same principles as a Roman arena. Beautiful architecture designed to contain violence performed for the entertainment of spectators who considered their own cruelty a form of culture. 300 of England's most powerful families stood beneath crystal chandeliers that cost more than villages, drinking champagne that tasted like liquid ambition, and every single one of them turned when the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne entered the room. Serafina felt the collective attention like a change in gravity. Heavier, more deliberate. The weight of 300 simultaneous calculations. Who to align with, who to distance from, which version of this marriage to publicly endorse, settling across the room like fog rolling through a valley. Cadrick's hand remained at the small of her back. Not pressing, not guiding, simply present, the way a wall is present behind someone standing at the edge of a cliff. The contact transmitted information in both directions. She could feel the coiled tension in his fingers, and he could feel, she knew, the rigid architecture of her spine refusing to bend. They moved through the crowd together. The first approach came within 30 seconds. Lord Whitmore, a round man with political ambitions inversely proportional to his intelligence, materialized at Kaedric's elbow with a glass of champagne and a smile calibrated to maximum inoffensiveness. Your Grace, what a pleasure. And the Duchess. We've heard so much. I imagine you have, Kaedric said, most of it fabricated. Whitmore's smile held, but his eyes performed the rapid lateral movement of a man checking escape routes. Of course. Of course. Simply delighted to see you both. London has been so curious. London can remain curious. We're not here to satisfy appetites. Whitmore retreated with the practiced speed of a man accustomed to being dismissed by people who mattered more than he did. Serafina watched him dissolve back into the crowd and leaned slightly toward Kaedric. You could try not terrifying everyone in the first minute. I could. I won't. We need allies tonight, not casualties. The two are not mutually exclusive. She almost smiled. The impulse was becoming harder to suppress. This dangerous gravitational pull toward a man whose idea of social engagement was thinly veiled warfare. She redirected her attention to the room, scanning faces, cataloging positions, mapping the invisible lines of allegiance and animosity that crisscrossed the ballroom like tripwires. Adrian was no longer at the marble column. She registered his absence the way a navigator registers a missing landmark, with immediate, instinctive alarm. He had been there when they entered. Now the column stood empty, and the champagne glass he had been holding sat abandoned on a passing servant's tray. He's moved, she said. Kaedric's fingers tightened against her back, a fractional increase in pressure that communicated everything his face refused to show. I see it. The plan hasn't changed. The plan was conceived before we entered a room with 300 witnesses and a man who wants to dismantle us. The plan holds. She turned to face him, and the movement created a brief pocket of privacy in the middle of the most public event of the season. Do you trust me? His jaw worked. The scar along his temple caught the chandelier light and threw a thin silver line across his skin. For 3 seconds he stood completely still, and in those 3 seconds Serafina watched a man who had spent his entire life trusting no one attempt to override 33 years of operational conditioning. Go, he said. She went. Moving through the Ashbourne ballroom alone was a fundamentally different experience than moving through it beside Kaedric Blackthorn. Without the Duke's gravitational field bending the room around her, Serafina became visible in a new way, approachable, accessible, a separate entity whose allegiances and vulnerabilities could be tested independently. The Countess of Ashbourne intercepted her near the East Terrace doors. Lady Catherine Ashbourne was a woman in her middle 50s who had survived 3 decades of London society by developing a conversational style that combined genuine warmth with the precision of a scalpel. Duchess, how wonderful to finally meet you in person rather than in rumor. Lady Ashbourne, your home is extraordinary. My home is a stage. Everything interesting happens in the wings. Catherine's eyes were kind and sharp simultaneously, a combination Serafina recognized as the hallmark of women who had learned to weaponize empathy. How are you finding the North? Cold, structured, surprisingly educational. Blackthorn Keep has that effect. The first Duchess described it as living inside a clock, everything measured, everything timed, everything in service of a mechanism you can hear but never quite see. Catherine paused. She also said it was the only place in England where she felt entirely safe. Which Duchess was that? Kaedric's mother. The information landed with specific targeted weight. Serafina absorbed it without visible reaction, but internally she cataloged it alongside the frozen rose gardens, the reopened greenhouse, the estate that ran with mechanical precision because the man who built the machine had learned that disorder killed the people he loved. She sounds remarkable. She was, and she would have liked you enormously. Catherine touched Serafina's arm with the practiced intimacy of a woman who understood that physical contact at the right moment was worth more than an hour of conversation. Be careful tonight. There are people in this room who need your marriage to fail. I know. You know about Adrian. I'm not talking about Adrian. Before Serafina could pursue the warning, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom with the surgical precision of someone who had timed their entrance to coincide with maximum exposure. Duchess Blackthorn. At last. She turned. The man standing before her was Lord Edward Pemberton, the parliamentary ally Caedric trusted, the man Seraphina had identified in the library as the first defection in Adrian's campaign. He was tall, thin, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested his tailor was more expensive than his principles. His smile possessed the particular warmth of a fireplace that had been extinguished hours ago, but still looked inviting from across the room. Lord Pemberton. I must confess I wasn't certain you'd attend. There's been so much speculation about whether the Duke permits social engagements. The word permits detonated quietly between them. Seraphina felt its shrapnel. The implication of captivity, of control, of a woman who needed her husband's authorization to enter a ballroom, and understood immediately that this was not casual conversation. This was reconnaissance. The Duke doesn't permit or prohibit anything regarding my schedule, Lord Pemberton. I make my own arrangements. Of course, forgive me, the rumors have been so persistent one begins to lose track of which version to believe. Believe the version standing in front of you. Pemberton studied her with the evaluative attention of a man assessing an investment. Something in his expression shifted, a recalculation, the kind of micro-adjustment a chess player makes when an opponent moves a piece he did not anticipate being in play. You're quite direct for a duchess. I was direct before the title. The title just gave me a larger audience. He laughed. The sound was warm and hollow and designed to create the impression of genuine amusement. I can see why Caedric chose you. He's always preferred instruments with edges. Is that what I am? An instrument? You're whatever the Duke needs you to be, Duchess. That's the Blackthorn tradition. He lowered his voice, and the shift in volume created an involuntary pocket of intimacy. But I wonder, do you know what he needs you for? Has he explained the inheritance provisions? The deadline? The word deadline hit like a physical blow. Seraphina's expression did not change. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing maintained its rhythm. But somewhere deep in the structural foundation of her understanding, a crack appeared. Hairline, nearly invisible, but propagating with the slow inevitability of damage that could not be undone. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Pemberton's smile widened by exactly the margin required to communicate that he knew she was lying and respected the effort. Of course not. I've spoken out of turn. Please enjoy the evening, Duchess. He withdrew into the crowd with the smooth efficiency of a man who had delivered his payload and saw no reason to remain near the blast radius. Seraphina stood alone in the middle of the Ashbourne ballroom, surrounded by music and candlelight, and 300 people who were watching her with varying degrees of interest and malice, and she felt the crack in her foundation spreading. Inheritance provisions. Deadline. 2 words that reframed every gesture, every silent kindness, every carefully engineered act of devotion that had made her begin to believe the Duke of Blackthorn might be capable of something more than strategic generosity. She found Caedric across the room. He stood near the west wall in conversation with 2 men she recognized as senior members of Parliament, his posture communicating the specific authority of a man who did not participate in conversation so much as conduct them. His eyes found hers across the distance, and something passed between them, a question, a check, the quick signal exchange of 2 people operating in hostile territory. She held his gaze and gave nothing away, because giving something away would mean admitting that Pemberton's words had reached the one place she had been protecting, the small, newly constructed space inside her chest where she had begun, against every rational instinct, to believe that Caedric Blackthorn's attention might be more than architecture. The confrontation with Adrian came 40 minutes later. He found her on the East Terrace, where she had retreated to breathe air that did not taste like perfume and political calculation. The garden below was lit with lanterns strung between trimmed hedges, creating a landscape that looked beautiful and artificial in equal measure. You're avoiding me. Adrian stepped through the terrace doors with the confidence of a man who believed all doors existed to accommodate his passage. He had changed since Blackthorn Keep. The wounded sincerity was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused, closer to the man Caedric might have become if Caedric had chosen charm instead of force. I'm breathing, Adrian. Not everything is about you. In this room, tonight, everything is about me, or rather, about the story I've been telling. He moved to the terrace railing and stood close enough for their conversation to be intimate, but far enough to be deniable. You look beautiful, by the way. That color, Blackthorn blue. He's marking you, Serafina. You know that, right? You're wearing his family's brand. I'm wearing a dress. You're wearing a message. Every person in that ballroom read it the second you walked in. She belongs to the Duke. Don't approach. He paused. Does that feel like freedom to you? It feels like a marriage, which is what you offered me before you decided to run. I ran because I discovered what Kaedric was planning. The terrace seemed to contract. The lantern light flickered. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a string quartet launched into a waltz that sounded inappropriately festive for the conversation unfolding 15 feet from the dance floor. What was he planning? Adrian turned to face her fully. His expression had shed every layer of performance, and what remained was raw. Not honest, Serafina understood, but raw, which was a different thing entirely. Honesty implied accuracy. Rawness implied exposure. And exposed men were often more dangerous than controlled ones because they had nothing left to calculate. Our father's will contained a provision. If Kaedric failed to marry before his 35th birthday, half the Blackthorn estate transfers to me, legally, irrevocably. Adrian let the words settle. Kaedric turns 35 in March. Your wedding was in January. Do the math, Serafina. The crack that Pemberton had started now split wide open. She felt it happen. Not emotionally, not yet, but structurally. The careful architecture she had built over 6 weeks of marriage. The framework of understanding she had constructed around a man who opened greenhouses and placed writing desks near fireplaces and tightened his fingers against her back like she was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. That architecture shuddered and groaned and began to list sideways. You're lying. I'm not. Ask him. Ask him why he was at St. Crispin's with a carriage and formal attire 30 minutes after I left. Ask him why he married a woman he'd never spoken to before that morning. Ask him how many other eligible women he'd approached before the wedding that would have satisfied the provision. Adrian stepped closer. Ask him if you were his first choice or his last resort. You left me at the altar because I found out what he was doing. I found our father's will in his study the night before the wedding. The provision, the deadline, the whole mechanical exercise. He was going to let me marry you and then challenge the union on grounds of my debts and instability. He would have had the marriage annulled within 6 months and married you himself, properly, legally, with full control of the estate secured. Adrian's voice dropped to something that almost sounded like genuine anguish. I didn't run because I'm a coward, Serafina. I ran because I realized the entire wedding was a trap, his trap. And you were the bait. The string quartet finished the waltz. Applause drifted through the terrace doors like the sound of something breaking. Serafina stood perfectly still. She processed Adrian's words the way Kaedric processed threat assessments, systematically, compartmentally, without allowing any single piece of information to overwhelm the analytical framework. She separated fact from interpretation, evidence from accusation, verifiable claims from emotional manipulation. The provision was real. Pemberton's reference confirmed it independently. The timeline was real. January wedding, March birthday. The mathematics were damning. The preparedness was real. Kaedric himself had never denied planning for Adrian's absence, but the narrative, the story Adrian was constructing from these facts, contained gaps, assumptions, the specific kind of logical scaffolding that a desperate man erects when the truth alone isn't dramatic enough to achieve his objectives. If you knew all this before the wedding, Serafina said slowly, why didn't you tell me? I tried. I wrote you a letter that morning. I left it with, no. She cut through his explanation with a precision that surprised both of them. Not that morning. Before. If you discovered this the night before, you had 12 hours to reach me. My mother's house was 4 miles from the church. You could have sent a messenger. You could have come yourself. Instead, you disappeared and left me standing at an altar with no information and no choice. Adrian's mouth opened, closed. The rawness in his expression flickered, and behind it, Serafina glimpsed something mechanical, the gears of a performance adjusting to unexpected resistance. I was frightened. I wasn't thinking clearly. You're thinking very clearly now. You've been thinking clearly for 5 weeks, building a narrative, recruiting allies, undermining your brother's political relationships. None of that suggests a man paralyzed by fear. It suggests a man executing a strategy. That's not, you want the estate. You've always wanted the estate. And when you realized Kaedric would secure it through marriage, you didn't try to protect me. You tried to make sure the marriage failed. She heard her own voice as though it belonged to someone else. Someone colder, harder, built from different material. You didn't come to Blackthorn Keep to rescue me, Adrian. You came to recruit me. Seraphina, did you send Pemberton to talk to me tonight? The silence answered before Adrian could. She saw it in the micro-expression. The fractional widening of his eyes, the involuntary swallow, the almost imperceptible shift in weight that betrayed the body's recognition of exposure before the mind could construct a defense. You did. She felt something close inside her chest, not with a snap, with the slow, deliberate rotation of a lock being engaged. You choreographed this entire evening. Pemberton delivers the provision. You deliver the context. And I'm supposed to walk back into that ballroom and look at my husband and see a liar. He is a liar. Maybe, but you're worse, because Kaedric at least had the decency to lie to my face. You lied from a distance and called it concern. She turned to walk back inside. Adrian caught her wrist. The contact was light, barely more than a suggestion of grip, but it crossed a boundary that both of them understood was structural, not physical. In the economy of power that governed every interaction between these three people, Adrian touching Seraphina without permission was not a gesture, it was a claim. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. Remove it. Listen to me. Whatever you think about my methods, the provision is real. He married you to save his empire. Everything else, the roses, the books, the writing desk by the fire, that's set dressing. That's a man who understands that a prisoner who believes she's a guest never tries to escape. Remove your hand, Adrian. He released her. She walked through the terrace doors without looking back, into the ballroom, into the light, into the noise and judgment and 300 pairs of eyes that tracked her movement with the passive aggression of a society that consumed women like fuel. She found Kaedric. He was where she expected him, near the west wall, holding a conversation he clearly did not care about with a man who clearly did not matter. His gaze locked onto her the moment she appeared, and she watched his body perform the rapid threat assessment that had become as familiar to her as her own breathing. His eyes swept her face, her hands, her posture, cataloging data points, searching for damage. He found it. She saw the recognition hit him, the fractional tightening around his eyes, the slight forward shift of his weight, the way his hand moved toward her and then stopped because they were in public and the Duke of Blackthorn did not display vulnerability in public. What happened? Not a question, a demand for intelligence. We need to leave. What did he say to you? We need to leave now, Kaedric. Her use of his name, his actual name, not the title, not the formal address, cut through his operational protocols like a knife through wire. She had never used it before. The intimacy of it, the raw, unrehearsed humanness of the two syllables, broke something in the rigid architecture of the moment and replaced it with something neither of them had prepared for. Urgency. Kaedric abandoned his conversation without excuse or explanation. He took Seraphina's arm and moved toward the entrance with the focused velocity of a man who had decided that the tactical value of remaining at Ashbourne Palace had been exceeded by the strategic necessity of protecting something he could not afford to lose. They were 18 steps from the door when Adrian's voice cut through the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen. The room shifted. Conversations dimmed. Bodies turned. Adrian stood on the raised platform near the orchestra, a champagne glass in his hand, his voice carrying with the natural projection of a man who had been performing for audiences since childhood. Forgive the interruption. I know we're all here to celebrate Lady Ashbourne's legendary hospitality, but I couldn't let the evening pass without acknowledging the presence of my brother and his remarkable new bride. Kaedric stopped walking. His hand on Seraphina's arm went rigid. Don't, she whispered. Don't react. That's what he wants. Some of you have heard rumors about the circumstances of their marriage, Adrian continued, his voice warm and measured and laced with the specific kind of poison that tastes like sincerity. I want to set the record straight. My brother is one of the most strategic men in England. Everything he does, every relationship he builds, every alliance he forms, every person he brings into the Blackthorn fold serves a purpose. The room held its breath. And I think we should all raise a glass to the strategic genius of a man who found a way to save his inheritance and acquire a beautiful wife in the same afternoon. The word inheritance detonated in the silence like a mortar round. 300 heads swiveled toward Caedric. The collective gaze of the English aristocracy, hungry, fascinated, merciless, focused on the Duke of Blackthorn with the concentrated intensity of a lens directing sunlight onto a single point. Serafina felt Caedric's entire body change beside her. Not collapse, not fracture. Something more fundamental. The deep, tectonic shift of a man whose most carefully guarded secret had just been detonated in front of every person whose respect he had spent 12 years earning. She looked up at his face. What she saw there was not anger, not humiliation, not the cold strategic recalculation she had come to expect from a man who processed threats the way machines processed raw material. What she saw was fear, real fear, the kind that lives beneath every layer of control and discipline and ruthless self-construction. The kind that a man like Caedric Blackthorn had spent his entire adult life building walls against. Not fear of enemies or political rivals or financial ruin, but the singular, devastating fear of being truly seen by the one person whose judgment he could not survive. He looked at Serafina, and in his eyes she saw the question he would never ask aloud. The one question that every calculated gesture, every silent act of devotion, every engineered environment had been designed to prevent her from ever needing to answer. Was any of it real? She looked back at him, standing in the middle of 300 witnesses and the wreckage of every assumption she had built about this man and this marriage, and she realized that the answer to that question would determine not just the future of the Blackthorn Empire, but the fundamental architecture of who she was willing to become. The ballroom waited. Adrian smiled from the platform, and Serafina Blackthorn stood at the exact center of a detonation and understood that whatever she did next, stay or go, speak or remain silent, reach for his hand or let it fall, there was no version of this moment that did not permanently destroy something she needed. She reached for his hand. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical flourish that 300 aristocrats would have needed to interpret the gesture as performance. She reached for his hand the way a person reaches for something essential in the dark, instinctively, without calculation, without any consideration for who was watching or what conclusions they would draw. Her fingers closed around Caedric's. The contact broke through every protocol they had negotiated, every careful distance, every unspoken agreement about what this marriage was and was not permitted to become. Her hand found his and held it with a grip that communicated a single, devastating message to the most powerful room in England. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Caedric's fingers did not move for 3 full seconds. She counted. 3 seconds during which the Duke of Blackthorn stood frozen in the wreckage of his most carefully guarded secret, his hand held by a woman he had married for survival and was now holding on to for something he could not name, while his brother smiled from the platform and the aristocracy waited for blood. Then his fingers closed around hers. The grip was crushing, not violent, never violent, but possessive in a way that transcended the word's usual meaning. This was not a man claiming property. This was a man who had spent his entire life learning to hold things without needing them, and was now, in the most public possible moment, admitting that he needed something so badly the admission alone could destroy him. Serafina turned to face the ballroom. Thank you for the toast, Lord Adrian. Her voice carried with a clarity that surprised even her. Steady, warm, pitched perfectly for a room that had been engineered for acoustics. It's true that the Duke of Blackthorn is the most strategic man in England. I can confirm that from personal experience. The room held its breath. But strategy alone doesn't open greenhouses in January. Strategy doesn't place writing desks near fireplaces. Strategy doesn't notice which books a woman mentions in passing and make them appear the next morning without a word of explanation. She paused. Strategy is what gets a man to the altar. What keeps him there is something your brother has never had the vocabulary to discuss, so I'll do it for him. She looked at Caedric. He looked back at her with an expression that 300 people would misremember for the rest of their lives. Some would call it shock, others gratitude, A few might come close to the truth and call it the face of a man watching someone fight for him for the first time in his existence. The Duke married me because he needed to. I'm staying because I choose to. And anyone in this room who mistakes that distinction hasn't been paying attention. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Lady Catherine Ashbourne began to clap. The sound was solitary at first, a single pair of hands breaking through the crystallized tension of the ballroom, and then it multiplied. Not unanimously, not universally, but enough. Enough hands joining the applause to shift the atmospheric pressure, to redirect the collective narrative, to transform Adrian's attempted detonation into something that looked, from the right angle, like a celebration. Adrian's smile did not waver, but his eyes changed. The warmth drained from them with the speed of liquid evacuating a cracked vessel, and what remained was the cold, concentrated fury of a man who had fired his best ammunition and watched his target not only survive, but convert the shrapnel into armor. He descended from the platform without another word. Cadric leaned close enough for his breath to reach her ear. We leave. Now. Now we stay. Serafina, we stay for 1 hour. We dance. We speak to every ally in this room. We let them see exactly what Adrian failed to destroy. She squeezed his hand once, hard. You wanted a duchess, Cadric. Let me be one. They stayed for 90 minutes. Serafina moved through the ballroom with the focused precision of a woman conducting a military campaign in a silk gown. She spoke with Lady Ashbourne, with Lord Whitmore, with the wives of Cadric's parliamentary allies, with the elderly Dowager Marchioness of Kentworth, who controlled more political influence from her wheelchair than most men controlled from their seats in Parliament. She smiled when smiling served the objective and did not smile when severity worked better, and she calibrated every interaction with the instinctive social intelligence of a woman who had grown up watching her mother survive on nothing but charm and terror. Cadric watched her work. He stood near the west wall with a glass he never drank from and observed his wife dismantle his brother's campaign with the systematic thoroughness of someone clearing a minefield. Every conversation she conducted repositioned an ally. Every handshake recalibrated a relationship. Every carefully placed compliment restored a bridge Adrian had spent weeks burning. Something happened to Cadric Blackthorne during those 90 minutes that no one in the ballroom recognized, because no one in the ballroom had the framework to identify it. The Duke of Blackthorne, a man who had governed for 12 years through the absolute conviction that strength required solitude, watched another person fight for his empire and realized that the terror coursing through his system was not the fear of losing control. It was the fear of wanting to share it. The realization settled into his chest like a blade. Not the kind that kills, but the kind a surgeon uses, cutting away something that needed to be removed for the organism to survive. He had built Blackthorne Keep as a fortress against precisely this vulnerability. Every protocol, every rigid schedule, every measured distance between himself and every other human being had been designed to prevent the catastrophic exposure that occurred when a man allowed someone else to become essential. And here she was, essential, operating inside his defenses with the casual authority of someone who had been given the keys and intended to use them. The carriage ride back to their London residence lasted 22 minutes, and Cadric spent every one of them in silence. Not the strategic silence Serafina had learned to read during their first 5 weeks. A different silence, heavier, loaded with something that pressed against the walls of his self-control like water against a dam. She sat across from him and waited. 3 blocks from the residence, he spoke. The inheritance provision is real. I know. My father's will stipulated that if I failed to marry before my 35th birthday, half the Blackthorne holdings transfer to Adrian. The financial infrastructure, the northern properties, the parliamentary seats attached to those properties, everything I've spent 12 years building. I know, Cadric. I was at St. Crispin's because I had spent 4 months preparing for Adrian's failure. I knew his debts. I knew his temperament. I knew that the probability of him completing the ceremony was diminishing by the week. I had a contingency. Me. You. The word cost him something physical. She could see it in the tendons of his neck, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands pressed flat against his thighs as though preventing them from reaching for something. You were the contingency, not the first option, not the ideal candidate. The contingency. A woman from a family with enough social standing to satisfy the legal requirements and enough financial desperation to accept an offer made under extreme conditions. The carriage wheels turned. London moved past the windows in a blur of gaslight and shadow. "That's what you were on January 14th, he said. "A structural solution to a dynastic problem." "And what am I now?" The question hung in the dark interior of the carriage like a flare dropped into deep water, illuminating things that had lived their entire existence in darkness. Cedric looked at her. The streetlights caught his face in intermittent flashes. Light, shadow, light, shadow. And in those alternating moments of visibility, Serafina watched a man's entire emotional architecture undergo catastrophic restructuring. "I don't have a word for what you are now. Try. You're the only person who has ever made me consider the possibility that control is not the same thing as strength." His voice dropped to a register she had never heard, raw, stripped, the vocal equivalent of an open wound. "You are the only person who has looked at the machinery I built and understood that it exists because the man inside it is terrified of what happens when the machine stops." "What happens when the machine stops?" "I feel things." 2 words, delivered with the same inflection another man might use to confess a terminal diagnosis. Because for Cedric Blackthorne, the admission was exactly that, the identification of a condition that his entire life had been designed to prevent, spreading through his system with the relentless efficiency of something that could not be negotiated with or controlled. Serafina crossed the carriage. She moved from her bench to his, closing the physical distance that had served as the last remaining boundary between the arrangement they had agreed to and the territory they were now entering. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to hear his breathing, which was not steady, which was not controlled, which was the breathing of a man whose operational systems were failing and whose body was responding to the failure with something dangerously close to honesty. "Then feel them," she said. The London residence, a townhouse in Mayfair that Cedric maintained for parliamentary obligations and used approximately 4 times per year, became a different space that night. Not because anything physical changed. The furniture remained. The staff continued their routines. The fires burned in their grates with the same measured efficiency. But the architecture of the relationship occupying the space underwent a fundamental transformation. They talked. Not the way they had talked before, the careful, measured exchanges of information across 30 feet of candlelit table, each sentence vetted for emotional content before delivery. They talked the way people talk when the walls come down and the rubble is too heavy to rebuild quickly, sitting together on a sofa in the upstairs study, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that silence felt like a shared language rather than a defensive perimeter. Cedric told her about his father, not the public version, the feared patriarch, the Iron Duke who forged the Blackthorne Empire through ruthless expansion, the private version, a man who punished emotional expression the way other men punished theft, who interpreted his eldest son's sensitivity as a structural defect to be corrected through systematic deprivation of warmth. A man who looked at a boy who loved his mother's rose garden and saw a liability. He told her about the day his mother died. He was 14. She had been ill for months, a wasting sickness that the physicians treated with increasingly desperate measures and decreasing honesty. Cedric had sat beside her bed every evening, reading to her from the books she loved, maintaining the fiction that reading was for her benefit when they both understood it was the only way a 14-year-old boy could say goodbye to the only person who had ever made him feel safe. His father had removed him from the room 2 hours before she died, had told him that watching a woman die was indulgent, that grief was a luxury the heir to Blackthorne could not afford, that the correct response to loss was the immediate reassessment of strategic priorities. Cedric had not cried at his mother's funeral, had not cried since, had built an entire empire on the foundation of that suppression, every protocol, every measured response, every rigid schedule functioning as a structural support, preventing the collapse of a man who had been forbidden to grieve at 14 and had never received permission to resume. Serafina listened without interrupting. She listened with her body angled toward his, her hand resting against his forearm, applying exactly enough pressure to communicate presence without demanding response. She listened the way she had learned to listen inside Blackthorne Keep, with patience, with analytical attention, with the growing recognition that understanding another person's damage was not the same as accepting responsibility for repairing it. When he finished, the study was dark except for the dying fire. The staff had retired. London hummed beyond the windows with the distant, indifferent energy of a city that consumed human drama the way furnaces consumed coal, efficiently, constantly, without particular interest in the individual components. "Your father was wrong," Serafina said. "My father built an empire. Your father built a prison and locked his son inside it and called it inheritance." She turned to face him fully, and in the low firelight his face looked different, younger, less defended, the face of the boy who had been removed from his mother's bedside and told that love was an operational liability. "You don't have to live inside it anymore. The provision is Adrian's weapon, not your cage. You've spent 12 years running an empire to prove that your father's methods work. But tonight, in that ballroom, you watched me fight for you using nothing he ever taught you. Warmth, honesty, the willingness to stand in front of 300 people and say something that cannot be taken back." She paused. "That's what saved us tonight. Not strategy, not control. The one thing your father tried to beat out of you." Kadric stared at her with the expression of a man watching the foundations of his reality undergo seismic revision. Every principle he had organized his life around, control, restraint, the systematic elimination of vulnerability, was being challenged not by an adversary but by an ally, and the difference between those two experiences was so vast it left him without functional responses. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Be the man you're describing. The man who chooses warmth, who allows vulnerability, who trusts." He shook his head slowly. "I was trained to be something else, and I've been that something else for so long I'm not certain the original version still exists." "It exists. I've seen it. In the greenhouse, in the writing desk, in the way you tighten your hand against my back when we enter a room, not to control where I go, but to make sure I know you're there." She reached up and touched the scar along his temple. The first time she had ever touched his face. Her fingers traced the thin line of raised tissue with a gentleness that made his breathing stutter. "What is this from?" "My father." She did not ask for details. The two words contained their own complete narrative. The casual, mechanical violence of a man who corrected his son's imperfections with physical precision. She leaned forward and pressed her lips against the scar. The contact lasted 3 seconds. When she pulled back, Kedrick Blackthorn's eyes were wet. Not crying. The Duke of Blackthorn did not cry. But his eyes were wet with the accumulation of 20 years of unfallen grief pressing against a dam that had finally, irreversibly, developed a crack. "The provision deadline is in 6 weeks, he said. His voice was thick, unsteady. "Adrian will escalate. He'll use Parliament. He'll use the courts. He'll use every weapon available to invalidate this marriage before March. Then we stop him." "How?" "By doing the one thing he'll never expect from you." She held his gaze. "You transfer the contested holdings into my name, voluntarily, publicly, before the deadline arrives." The silence that followed was absolute. "If the assets are mine," she continued, her voice steady, her logic precise, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it, "the provision becomes meaningless. Adrian can't claim what doesn't belong to you anymore. The will specifies a transfer from the Duke. It says nothing about assets held independently by the Duchess. You're asking me to hand you half the Blackthorn Empire. I'm asking you to trust me with it. That's the same thing. No, it's the opposite. Handing someone an empire is a transaction. Trusting someone with an empire is a transformation." Kadric stared at her in the dying firelight, and Serafina watched the war play out across his features with the brutal intimacy of someone who had earned the right to witness it. Every instinct his father had installed, every protocol, every defensive reflex, every deeply encoded instruction that equated vulnerability with death, fought against the possibility she was offering, fought hard. Fought with the desperate energy of systems that understood their own obsolescence. She did not push. She sat beside him in the dark study of a London townhouse while the fire collapsed into embers and the city murmured beyond the windows, and the most powerful man she had ever known wrestled with the most terrifying decision of his life. The decision to stop being his father's son and start being the man his mother's roses had always known he could become. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll have the solicitors draft the transfer documents tomorrow." He reached for her, not with the controlled precision of the Duke of Blackthorn, with the raw, uncoordinated urgency of a man who had spent 20 years behind fortified walls and was now stepping through the breach with no guarantee of survival, only the devastating, irrational conviction that whatever waited on the other side could not possibly be worse than the isolation he was leaving behind. His hand found her face. His palm settled against her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with the reverent, terrified attention of a man touching something he had convinced himself he would never deserve. "If this destroys me," he whispered, "it will have been worth it. It won't destroy you. You don't know that. I know that you survived your father. You survived Adrian. You survived 14 years of building an empire on a foundation of suppressed grief." She covered his hand with hers. "You can survive being loved, Kaedric. It's the only thing that hasn't tried to kill you yet." 3 days later, the transfer documents were signed. Kedrick Blackthorn, Duke of Blackthorn, formally placed 46% of the Blackthorn estate holdings into the independent legal ownership of Seraphina Blackthorn, Duchess of Blackthorn. The paperwork was filed with the Crown's registry, witnessed by 3 senior solicitors, and executed with the kind of legal precision that left no room for challenge, reinterpretation, or reversal. The news reached Adrian within hours. It reached Parliament within days. It reached every drawing room, every gentleman's club, every political back channel in London within a week. And the reaction was exactly what Kaedric had predicted. Not admiration, not respect. Fear. The deep primal collective fear of an aristocracy watching one of its most powerful members voluntarily surrender control, the foundational currency of their entire social order, to a woman who had been a discarded bride 8 weeks ago. They called it madness. They called it manipulation. They called it the most dangerous political miscalculation in a generation. Adrian called it an opening. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by parliamentary courier to the London residence with the official seal of the Lord Chancellor's office. Adrian Blackthorn, supported by 7 members of Parliament, had filed a formal petition challenging the mental competency of the Duke of Blackthorn and requesting an emergency review of the estate transfer on grounds of undue influence exercised by the Duchess. Kaedric read the summons at the breakfast table. His face did not change. His hands did not shake. His breathing maintained its rhythm, but Seraphina, sitting across from him, saw the moment the old machinery engaged, the cold, mechanical systems of a man who had been trained to process threats, the way industrial equipment processes raw material, grinding everything into components that could be controlled, managed, neutralized. "He's challenging your competency," she said. "He's challenging my judgment, which, given that I just handed half my empire to a woman I've known for 2 months, is not an unreasonable legal argument. We anticipated this. We anticipated resistance. We did not anticipate a formal competency review backed by 7 sitting members of Parliament." He set down the summons. "Adrian has been building this coalition for weeks. Pemberton, Whitmore, the Ashbourne contingent. Every ally I thought I'd secured has been turned. Not all of them. Enough of them." He looked at her across the breakfast table, and in his eyes she saw the terrifying intersection of the man he was becoming and the man he had been. The new vulnerability colliding with the old machinery, producing something volatile and unpredictable and more dangerous than either version alone. "He's going to use you. In the hearing, he's going to argue that you manipulated me, that the marriage was designed to circumvent the provision, and that the transfer was the final move in a scheme you orchestrated from the moment you said yes at St. Crispin's. Then I'll testify. You'll be under oath. They'll ask about the terms of our marriage. They'll ask whether I told you about the provision before the wedding. They'll ask whether affection preceded the transfer or followed it. And I'll tell them the truth. The truth is complicated. The truth is always complicated. That doesn't make it unusable." Kedrick pushed back from the table. He stood and walked to the window, and for a moment the morning light caught him in full profile. The scar, the rigid jaw, the eyes that contained the accumulated weather of a man standing at the intersection of everything he had been and everything he was terrified of becoming. "There is one option Adrian hasn't considered," he said slowly. "What?" "I appear before Parliament myself, not through solicitors, not through intermediaries. I stand in front of every man who has ever feared me or owed me or whispered about me behind closed doors, and I tell them exactly why I married you, and exactly why I transferred the holdings, and exactly what this marriage has become. That means full disclosure, the provision, the contingency, everything. Everything. You'll be handing your enemies the complete architecture of your vulnerability." He turned from the window. The morning light hit his back and threw his face into shadow, and in that shadow she saw something she had never seen before on the face of the Duke of Blackthorn. Resolution. Not the cold, strategic determination she had come to recognize. Something warmer, fiercer. The incandescent certainty of a man who had finally understood that the most dangerous thing he could do to his enemies was not threaten them, or outmaneuver them, or crush them beneath the weight of his authority. It was show them he was no longer afraid. "Adrian's entire strategy depends on the assumption that I would rather lose the empire than admit weakness," Kedrick said. "He's wrong. He's been wrong about me his entire life, and he's wrong now, and I'm going to walk into Parliament and prove it in a way that makes it impossible for him to ever use my fear against me again." Kedrick. "The hearing is scheduled for Thursday. 3 days." He moved toward her with the focused velocity of a man who had made a decision that could not be unmade. "I need you to understand what I'm about to do. I'm about to stand before the most powerful legislative body in England and tell them that I married you as a contingency and fell in love with you by accident and transferred half my empire because I trust you more than I trust myself. I'm about to volunteer every weapon Adrian needs to destroy me, and I'm going to do it because the man my father built would never have considered it possible, and I am finished being that man." He stood before her, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his skin, could smell the cedar and cold stone scent that she had come to associate with everything this man represented. "Thursday," he said. She took his hand, held it, felt the pulse hammering in his wrist, fast, irregular, the heartbeat of a man on the edge of the most terrifying act of his life. "Thursday," she said. The parliamentary chamber waited like a stone throat ready to swallow them both. Kedrick's solicitors had spent 48 hours preparing arguments they already knew would be insufficient, because the case Adrian had built was not a legal challenge. It was a narrative, the story of a manipulative duke and a compliant bride executing a financial scheme disguised as a marriage, and narratives were not defeated with evidence. They were defeated with better narratives. Thursday morning arrived cold and sharp, the kind of London winter that cut through wool and leather and reached the bone beneath. Serafina dressed in blackthorn blue, Kedrick dressed in black. They descended the townhouse stairs together, side by side, and the carriage that waited for them outside bore the blackthorn crest on its doors like a declaration of war. The crowds outside Parliament had already gathered. Word of the hearing had spread through London with the velocity of scandal. The feared Duke of Blackthorn, the mysterious Duchess, the brothers' accusation of incompetence, the unprecedented asset transfer that had made every man in England simultaneously terrified of his wife. Kedrick stepped from the carriage into the gray morning light, and for one moment, one fractional, unguarded instant, he looked up at the stone facade of Parliament with an expression Serafina recognized from the frozen rose garden at Blackthorn Keep. The expression of a man standing at the edge of something vast and cold and understanding that the only way through it was forward. He extended his hand to her. She took it. They walked up the steps of Parliament together, into the building, past the guards and the clerks, and the gathered politicians who watched their approach with the hungry attention of men about to witness something unprecedented, and the doors of the hearing chamber opened before them like the gates of a kingdom that was about to be either saved or lost. Inside, Adrian sat at the petitioner's table with his 7 parliamentary allies arranged behind him like a formation. His expression was composed, confident, arranged into the specific configuration of a man who believed he had already won. Kedrick took his seat at the respondents' table. Serafina sat behind him. The Lord Chancellor called the chamber to order, and Kedrick Blackthorn, Duke of Blackthorn, The most feared and most disciplined man in England opened his mouth to do the one thing his father had spent a lifetime teaching him was fatal. He began to tell the truth. The chamber smelled like old wood and centuries of accumulated consequence. Kedrick stood at the respondent's lectern, and the silence that preceded his first word was the kind of silence that exists inside a held breath, pressurized, finite, aware of its own approaching end. 47 members of Parliament occupied the viewing gallery. 7 sat behind Adrian at the petitioner's table. The Lord Chancellor presided from the elevated bench with the weary neutrality of a man who had adjudicated enough aristocratic disputes to understand that justice was rarely the actual objective. Serafina sat 3 feet behind her husband and watched him grip the edges of the lectern with both hands. Not for support, for anchor. The way a man grips something solid before deliberately stepping into a current strong enough to carry him away. "My lords," Kedrick began. His voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent 33 years perfecting the instrument and was now, for the first time, using it to play something other than authority. "My brother has petitioned this body to declare me mentally incompetent. He argues that my decision to transfer Blackthorn holdings to my wife constitutes evidence of diminished judgment. He suggests I have been manipulated, coerced, that the Duchess of Blackthorn exploited emotional vulnerability to engineer a financial outcome." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. It was structural, the momentary silence of a man crossing from the territory of strategy into the unmapped landscape of honesty. "He is half right." The gallery stirred. Adrian's solicitor looked up from his papers. Adrian himself leaned forward with the hungry attention of a predator detecting wounded movement. "My judgment has been altered, not diminished, altered, by a woman who walked into my life under the most transactional circumstances imaginable and proceeded to demonstrate, with patience I did not deserve and persistence I could not have anticipated, that the machinery I built to run this empire was also the machinery that was killing the man inside it." He released the lectern, stepped to the side of it. The movement was deliberate, removing the barrier between himself and the chamber, eliminating the last physical structure standing between the Duke of Blackthorn and complete exposure. "I will tell you exactly what happened, every detail my brother has implied but never proven, because proving it would require access to the truth, and the truth has never been Adrian's preferred currency." For the next 40 minutes, Kedrick Blackthorn dismantled his own legend. He described his father's will, the provision, the deadline, the cold mechanical calculation that had driven him to St. Crispin's Church, with a contingency plan instead of a conscience. He described the marriage as what it had been, a transaction executed under duress, designed to preserve an empire that he had spent 12 years defending with methods inherited from a man who believed that emotional attachment was a structural deficiency. He described Serafina, not as a wife, not as a duchess, not as the strategic partner his brother's petition characterized her as. He described her as the first person in 20 years who had looked at the architecture of his control and understood that it was not strength, it was scar tissue. The accumulated defensive response of a boy who had been removed from his dying mother's bedside and told that love was an operational liability. The chamber was absolutely silent. "My brother argues that the asset transfer demonstrates incompetence," Kedrick continued. "I would argue the opposite. For 12 years I have managed the Blackthorn estate alone. Every decision, every crisis, every political calculation filtered through a single point of authority, because I was taught that distributing power meant distributing vulnerability. That approach produced an empire. It also produced a man who could not sleep without reviewing security protocols, could not eat without analyzing strategic implications, could not stand in a room with his own wife without calculating the defensive positioning of every exit." He looked directly at Adrian. "That is not competence, brother. That is a man drowning in very expensive water." Adrian's face had undergone a series of rapid transformations during Kedrick's testimony, from confidence to uncertainty to the dawning recognition that the weapon he had engineered was being used against him with surgical precision. He had built his case on the assumption that Kedrick would defend the transfer as strategy, would argue legal precedent, would retreat behind the cold, impersonal language of dynastic management that had always been his shield. Instead, Kedrick had dropped the shield entirely. And an unshielded man, Adrian was discovering, was not the same thing as a vulnerable one. The transfer was not coerced, Kedrick said. It was not manipulated. It was the first genuinely free decision I have made since I was 14 years old. Every other decision, every acquisition, every alliance, every carefully managed relationship was made inside a framework designed by a dead man who believed that control was the only thing standing between his family and annihilation. I am standing before this body today to say that my father was wrong, and I am finished letting a dead man's fear govern a living man's choices. He turned to the Lord Chancellor. You may examine the transfer documents. You may interview the solicitors who drafted them. You may depose the Duchess under oath. You will find no evidence of manipulation, because there was none. What you will find is a man who spent 33 years building a fortress, and a woman who spent 8 weeks showing him that a fortress without anyone inside it worth protecting is just an expensive tomb. He returned to the lectern, placed his hands flat on its surface, met the Lord Chancellor's gaze with the steady, unblinking directness of a man who had bet everything on the most counterintuitive strategy in the history of English aristocratic litigation: total honesty. The Lord Chancellor called a recess. During the 90-minute adjournment, 3 things happened that would determine the outcome of the hearing and, by extension, the future of the Blackthorn dynasty. The first was that Lady Catherine Ashbourne, who had been observing from the public gallery, descended to the chamber floor and spoke privately with Lord Pemberton for approximately 11 minutes. The content of their conversation was never publicly disclosed, but Pemberton's expression when Catherine withdrew suggested a man who had just been informed that the ground beneath his feet was considerably less stable than he had believed. The second was that Adrian's solicitor requested a private conference with his client. The conference lasted 7 minutes. When it concluded, the solicitor's face wore the specific expression of a legal professional who had just advised his client to withdraw and been overruled. The third was that Serafina found Kedrick alone in the corridor outside the chamber, standing before a window that overlooked the Thames, his forehead resting against the cold glass. She stood beside him without speaking. His breathing was uneven. The controlled metronomic rhythm that she had come to understand as his baseline operational state had been replaced by something irregular and human and frightening in its unfamiliarity. He was breathing like a man who had just sprinted a great distance and was now standing still, trying to reconcile the body's demand for air with the mind's inability to process what had just occurred. "You did it," she said. "I haven't done anything yet. The Chancellor hasn't ruled. You stood in front of Parliament and told the truth about yourself. That's not nothing. For you, that's everything." He lifted his head from the glass. His eyes were bloodshot. The scar along his temple stood out against skin that had gone pale with exhaustion, and in the gray London light filtering through the window, he looked older than his 33 years and younger than she had ever seen him. Simultaneously, the man who ran an empire and the boy who had been dragged away from his mother's deathbed. "My father would have called this suicide," he said. "Your father is dead. His opinions are no longer operational." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not a smile. Not yet. But the preliminary tremor of an expression that had been suppressed so long its muscles had atrophied. "You sound like me. I've been living in your house for 2 months. Behavioral contamination was inevitable." This time the tremor reached his mouth, a fractional lift at one corner, the smallest, most reluctant, most hard-won near smile in the history of the Blackthorn bloodline. "Serafina." "Yes. Whatever happens in that chamber, whatever the Chancellor decides, I need you to understand that what I said in there was not strategy." "I know. I need you to understand that it was the first time in my adult life I have spoken without calculating the outcome first. I know, Kedrick. I need you to understand that I am terrified." She took his hand, held it against the cold window glass, felt his pulse hammering against her palm with the desperate, irregular rhythm of a heart that had been running on discipline for 2 decades and was now, finally, being asked to run on something else. "Being terrified means you have something to lose," she said. "That's not weakness. That's the first honest thing you felt since you were 14. The recess ended. They returned to the chamber. Adrian stood when the Lord Chancellor called for the petitioner's response, and for a moment Serafina saw in him the ghost of the man she had once agreed to marry, charming, confident, built from lighter material than his brother, designed for drawing rooms rather than battlefields. But something had changed during the recess. The confidence had curdled. What had been smooth assurance now carried the brittle quality of a performance that the performer himself had stopped believing in. "My lords," Adrian began, "my brother has delivered an impressive display of emotional theater. But sentiment does not change the legal reality. The provision in our father's will, Lord Adrian." The Lord Chancellor's voice cut through the chamber with the practiced authority of a man who had been managing aristocratic egos for 30 years. "This body has reviewed the transfer documents during the recess. We have also received correspondence from Lady Catherine Ashbourne regarding certain financial records she has made available to the review committee." Adrian's expression changed. The shift was small, a contraction around the eyes, a stiffening of the jaw, but Serafina recognized it instantly. The face of a man hearing the sound of a trap closing around him. "What financial records?" "Records pertaining to outstanding debts held in your name against 3 banking houses. Records of political contributions made to sitting members of this body in exchange for their support of this petition. And records of a private correspondence between yourself and Lord Pemberton in which you outlined a plan to challenge the Duchess's legal standing as a means of forcing a renegotiation of the Blackthorn estate division in your favor." The chamber erupted, not with noise, with the more devastating eruption of collective silence, the sound of 47 men simultaneously recalculating their positions, their allegiances, their exposure. Pemberton's face went the color of ash. Whitmore stared at the floor. The 7 parliamentary allies arranged behind Adrian shifted in their seats with the coordinated discomfort of men discovering that the ship they had boarded was taking on water. Adrian recovered quickly. He was, Serafina reflected, a man built for recovery. His entire personality was a recovery mechanism, designed to absorb impact and redistribute it as charm. But this time the impact was structural, and charm was insufficient currency. Those records have been taken out of context. "Lord Adrian." The Lord Chancellor's voice carried the specific temperature of a man who was no longer interested in arguments. "This body has sufficient grounds to dismiss the competency petition. The evidence of coordinated political interference in a private estate matter, combined with documented financial irregularities in the petitioner's own holdings, renders the petition not only groundless but potentially actionable." He looked at Adrian over the rim of his spectacles with the weary disgust of a man who had seen too many talented young aristocrats mistake cleverness for intelligence. "The petition is dismissed. This hearing is concluded." The gavel fell. The sound it made was small, wood against wood, mechanical, unremarkable. But inside the hearing chamber, it detonated with the force of a dynasty being rewritten. Cedric did not move, did not speak, did not react with the visible relief that every person in the chamber expected. He sat at the respondents' table with his hands flat on its surface and breathed, just breathed, with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man putting himself back together one breath at a time. Adrian stood frozen at the petitioner's table. His solicitor was already gathering papers with the hurried efficiency of a professional creating distance between himself and a sinking client. The 7 parliamentary allies had begun the process of strategic dispersal, each man calibrating the optimal speed at which to withdraw support without appearing to flee. Serafina watched Adrian's face. She watched the last remnants of his performance collapse and reveal the terrain underneath. Not the charming viscount, not the wronged brother, not the strategic adversary, but a man standing in the rubble of his own ambitions with the bewildered expression of someone who had been so focused on what he wanted to take that he had never considered the possibility that the taking itself might be the thing that destroyed him. For one moment, brief, involuntary, immediately suppressed, she felt something for him that was not anger. It was recognition. Adrian Blackthorn was his father's son too, built by the same brutal architect, shaped by the same impossible standards, damaged by the same systematic withdrawal of warmth. He had simply responded to the damage differently. Where Cedric had armored himself with control, Adrian had armored himself with charm, and both brothers had spent their adult lives mistaking their armor for their identity. The difference was that Ceadric had found someone willing to help him remove it. Adrian had not. She did not speak to him, did not approach. There was nothing she could offer that he would recognize as genuine, and nothing he could accept without interpreting as defeat. Some distances, she understood, existed because the people on either side of them had not yet built the vocabulary to cross. She turned to Ceadric. He was looking at her already, had been looking at her, she realized, since the gavel fell. His expression was stripped clean. No strategy, no calculation, no carefully managed emotional output. Just a man looking at a woman with the raw, unedited attention of someone seeing clearly for the first time after years of deliberately blurred vision. "Let's go home," she said. They did not return to the London townhouse. The carriage turned north, and Serafina did not ask why, because she already knew. London was the territory of strategy and performance, and the careful management of public identity. Blackthorn Keep was where the man she had married actually lived. Not the Duke, not the political operator, not the cold architect of a northern empire, but the man who opened greenhouses and placed writing desks near fireplaces and kept his mother's rose garden frozen in suspended animation because letting it die would mean acknowledging that the last gentle thing in his childhood was gone. They traveled through the night. The English countryside passed the carriage windows in shades of silver and black, and somewhere north of Birmingham the snow began. Not the heavy, oppressive snowfall of deep winter, but the lighter, almost tentative precipitation of early spring, the kind of snow that falls knowing it will not last. Ceadric slept. For the first time in their marriage, Serafina watched her husband sleep. He sat across from her with his head tilted against the padded wall of the carriage, his jaw finally unclenched, his hands resting open in his lap rather than pressed flat or curled into fists. In sleep, the architecture of his control dissolved entirely, and what remained was the unguarded face of a man who looked, in the shifting moonlight, remarkably like someone who had been carrying something impossibly heavy for an impossibly long time, and had finally, momentarily, set it down. She studied the scar along his temple, the line of his jaw, the faint dark circles beneath his eyes that no amount of discipline could eliminate because they were not the product of insufficient rest, but of the particular exhaustion that accumulates when a person spends decades at war with their own interior landscape. A man is not rebuilt in a single night, she thought, not in a single speech, a single hearing, a single act of terrifying honesty before a chamber full of men who trade in power the way merchants trade in grain. A man is rebuilt the way stone walls are rebuilt, one piece at a time, over seasons, with patience that sometimes feels indistinguishable from madness. And the person doing the rebuilding has to understand that the structure they are creating will never look like the original, because the original was designed by someone who did not have the builder's best interests at heart. She reached across the carriage and pulled his coat higher on his shoulders. The gesture was small and practical and entirely unnecessary, and it was the most intimate thing she had ever done. Blackthorn Keep emerged from the early morning mist like something dreamed into existence. The stone walls caught the first light of dawn and held it, turning the gray fortifications the color of pale gold. The towers that had looked like instruments of intimidation when Serafina first arrived now looked like what they had always been. Watchtowers. Not designed to threaten, but to observe, to stand guard, to ensure that whatever existed inside the walls remained protected from whatever waited outside. The carriage stopped at the main entrance. Hargraves materialized with the reliable inevitability that Serafina had stopped finding mechanical and now found oddly comforting, the steady, predictable presence of a man who had served this house for 30 years and would serve it for 30 more, because that was what devotion looked like when it was expressed through consistency rather than declaration. "Your Grace." He opened the door. His eyes passed over Serafina with something she had never seen in them before. Warmth. Suppressed, professionally inappropriate, and immediately concealed behind decades of trained neutrality, but warm nonetheless. "Welcome home." Ceadric stepped from the carriage. He stood in the courtyard of his estate and looked up at the walls with an expression Serafina could not immediately categorize. Not the systematic assessment of a man checking fortifications, not the territorial sweep of a man confirming dominion. Something quieter. Something that looked from the right angle like a man seeing his own home clearly for the first time. Hargraves. Your Grace. The East Wing, the Duchess's quarters. I want a second desk installed. The same dimensions as mine. Of course, Your Grace. In the Duchess's study? In mine. Hargraves processed this instruction with the professional composure of a man who understood that what he had just been told was not a furniture request. It was a constitutional amendment. The Duke's private study, the inner sanctum of the Blackthorn Empire, the room where every decision of consequence had been made in solitude for 12 years, was being opened. Very good, Your Grace. The old butler withdrew, and in his measured retreat, Serafina read the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a very long time for the walls of this house to accommodate more than one person. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. This was important. This was, in fact, the entire point. After the parliamentary hearing, after Adrian's public dismantling, after the transfer documents and the testimony and the headlines that consumed London society for the better part of a month, the most significant transformation in the history of the Blackthorn estate occurred in silence, without audience, without spectacle, through the accumulation of small, unremarkable daily acts of two people learning to occupy the same space without treating proximity as threat. Kedrick did not become a different man. That was the first thing Serafina understood, and the understanding mattered because it prevented her from building expectations on a foundation of fantasy. He was still rigid, still precise, still capable of the cold surgical authority that made tenants respect him and political rivals avoid him. He still rose at 5. Still rode the perimeter before breakfast. Still managed the estate with the systematic efficiency of a man who believed that discipline was not the enemy of feeling, but its necessary companion. But the machinery now included space for her, not as an addition, not as a concession, as a structural element. Her opinions appeared in his correspondence. Her judgment influenced his tenant decisions. Her presence at the breakfast table, which he had initially treated as an unexpected variable in his morning routine, became a fixed coordinate around which the rest of his day organized itself. She pushed back, often, loudly, about estate management decisions she considered unnecessarily harsh, about staff protocols she found dehumanizing, about the residual habits of a man who had been trained to interpret kindness as compromise and compromise as weakness. They argued at dinner, over accounts, across the shared desk in his study, where two sets of correspondence now occupied equal space. The arguments were not gentle. They were not polite. They were the abrasive, honest, sometimes painful collisions of two people who had decided that friction was preferable to the polished surface of a relationship where nothing real ever made contact. And through those collisions, something was being built. Not the fairy tale architecture of a love story that resolves in a single transformative moment. Something more durable. Something that looked, from a distance, like two people constructing a shared foundation, one difficult conversation at a time. Laying stones that did not always fit together perfectly, but held weight because the mortar between them was honesty rather than performance. Spring arrived at Blackthorn Keep the way spring arrives at any place that has endured a long winter. Gradually, hesitantly, with the cautious optimism of a season that has learned from experience not to trust its own warmth too early. The frozen gardens thawed. The rose bushes in his mother's garden, maintained for 12 years in suspended animation, began to produce new growth, not from the preserved branches Kedrick had kept alive through mechanical intervention, but from the roots. New shoots pushing through old soil, life generating itself from beneath the surface of something everyone had assumed was merely being preserved. Serafina found him there on a morning in late March, kneeling in the wet soil of the rose garden, his hands dirty, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, staring at a cluster of new buds with an expression she had never seen on his face. Grief. Not the suppressed, weaponized, structurally reinforced grief he had been carrying since he was 14. Real grief. The kind that arrives only when a person finally feels safe enough to experience what they were forbidden to feel when the loss actually occurred. The kind that surfaces not as weakness, but as the body's belated acknowledgement that something precious was lost, and the loss mattered, and the mattering was not a deficiency, but a measure of what was loved. She knelt beside him in the dirt. The spring air smelled like wet earth and something green and impossibly alive. She would have liked this, Kedrick said. His voice was thick, unsteady, the voice of a man speaking through 20 years of accumulated silence. New growth. She always said the point of a garden wasn't preserving what existed. It was creating conditions for what came next. She sounds like someone who understood that strength and tenderness aren't opposites. They were, in this house, for a very long time. And now? He looked at her. His eyes were wet, not crying, not yet, but closer than he had been since the night in the London study, and the proximity to that edge, the willingness to stand near it without retreating, was itself a form of courage that his father would never have recognized as such. Now I have a desk in my study that isn't mine, he said, and a woman who argues with me about tenant policy at 7 in the morning, and a rose garden that's growing things I didn't plan. He reached for her hand. His fingers were cold and dirty, and they closed around hers with a grip that had evolved from the desperate, crushing pressure of a man holding on for survival to something different. Something that held firmly but not fearfully. Something that understood the distinction between possession and presence. I spent 12 years protecting this place from everyone, he said. I never considered the possibility that what it needed was not protection. It needed someone to live in it. The morning light moved across the garden. Somewhere beyond the walls, the northern countryside stretched toward a horizon that was, for the first time in months, free of snow. The towers of Blackthorn Keep cast long shadows across the grounds, but the shadows were retreating, pulled back by a sun that had apparently renegotiated its truce with this particular stretch of England and decided to show up after all. Serafina leaned into him. He put his arm around her. The contact was imperfect, his elbow at the wrong angle, her shoulder pressed awkwardly against his chest. Neither of them practiced enough at this particular geometry to execute it with the precision they applied to everything else. It was the most honest position either of them had ever occupied. Kedrick. Yes. The transfer documents, the 46%, I want to restructure them. He looked at her with the wary attention of a man whose trust had been hard won and was still, in certain lights, fragile enough to fracture. Restructure how? Joint holdings. Not mine. Not yours. Ours. Managed together. Decided together. Every tenant decision, every investment, every political alignment run through both desks in that study. That's inefficient. That's partnership. Partnership is slower than unilateral authority. Partnership is also the reason you're sitting in a garden instead of a courtroom right now. Efficiency is how your father ran this estate, and efficiency is what nearly cost you everything. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that Serafina had learned to distinguish from his strategic silences. This was processing quiet, the sound of a man whose interior architecture was accommodating a new load-bearing element and checking whether the structure could hold. Joint holdings, he repeated. Joint everything. You understand that means neither of us can act alone. That's not a limitation, Kedrick. That's the point. He looked at the rose garden, at the new buds pushing through old wood, at the evidence of growth that occurred not because someone controlled it, but because someone created conditions where it became possible. Have Hargraves arrange a meeting with the solicitors, he said. Monday. Monday. And Serafina. Yes. Stop kneeling in the mud. You'll ruin your dress. You're kneeling in the mud. I'm the Duke. I'm allowed to ruin things. You're the Duke who just agreed to share his authority with his wife. I think the rules about what you're allowed to ruin have changed. He looked at her. And this time, for the first time since she had known him, the expression that crossed his face was unmistakable. Not the ghost of a smile, not the memory of one, not the preliminary tremor of an emotion his muscles had forgotten how to produce. A smile, small, reluctant, fought for and hard won, and costing him something visible in the effort required to allow it past the defenses of a lifetime. But real, present, alive in a way that transformed the geography of his face and gave Serafina a glimpse of the boy who had loved his mother's rose garden before a brutal man taught him that love was something to be engineered out. Come inside, he said. It's cold. It's spring. It's spring at Blackthorn Keep. That's a different thing entirely. They stood together, walked together through the garden, past the newly budding roses, past the greenhouse that still bloomed with the hundreds of red flowers Kaedric had ordered into existence because she once admired the view from her window. They entered the keep through the east corridor, where the stone walls held the morning light in a way that made the ancient building look less like a fortress and more like what it was slowly, reluctantly, and irreversibly becoming: a home. In the study, two desks faced each other across a room that had been designed for solitary authority and was now being repurposed for something the Blackthorn family had never attempted in its 300-year history: collaboration. Kaedric sat at his desk. Serafina sat at hers. Between them, the morning correspondence waited. Estate reports, tenant petitions, political communications, the accumulated machinery of an empire that would continue to demand attention and discipline, and the relentless application of intelligent management for as long as either of them lived. But the machinery had changed. It was no longer a system designed to execute the will of one man with flawless precision. It was a system designed to hold two people's combined judgment, two people's competing perspectives, two people's willingness to argue and disagree and push back and ultimately choose together because they had both learned, through damage, through fear, through the slow and painful process of dismantling defenses that had been built for survival and discovering that survival without connection was just loneliness wearing better clothes, that strength shared was not strength halved, it was strength transformed. Kaedric opened the first letter, read it, passed it across the desk to Serafina without comment. She read it, made a note in the margin, passed it back. He read her note, nodded once, and set the letter aside. The exchange took 11 seconds. It contained no drama, no spectacle, no 300-person audience, no parliamentary testimony, no ballroom confrontation. Just two people sitting across from each other in a stone room in northern England, doing the quiet, unglamorous, infinitely difficult work of building something durable from the wreckage of everything they had been taught to be. Outside, the spring sun climbed higher over Blackthorn Keep, and in the rose garden below the study windows, his mother's bushes continued their slow, patient, extraordinary work of growing something new from roots that everyone had mistaken for dead.